In this last, perhaps most important section, we will emphasize how individual racial identity formation and an understanding of intersectionality is necessary for anti-racist solidarity. After the civil rights, Chicano, Black Power, feminist, and gay lesbian movements of the 1960s, the baby boomer generation began developing our understanding of racial identity formation. Influenced by the Black Power movement, Dr. William Cross developed a theory of nigrescence, the process of developing one's Black identity. He later modified it such that it has 6 sectors from birth to adulthood, in which one sector is adult nigrescence. And this word means becoming Black. Sense is like senescence in medicine. In the pre-encounter stage, an individual is either assimilated or anti-Black. This continues until an encounter, an event or series of events where the individual Black person is forced to confront their Black identity, after which they enter immersion and emersion, immersion and emersion. And immersion with an I, they're immersed or thrown into their culture. They learn about their culture, they endorse their Black culture, and they reject white culture. They become potentially argumentative and confrontational, and they start to internalize their Black identity. As they do so, they enter immersion with an E. They emerge and are then characterized by a more nuanced, less confrontational attitude, but they may confuse people who are fully internalized with those who are still behind them in the pre-encounter stage. In the later internalization stage, Black individuals relate authentically with others, but still socialize effectively with people who disagree with them. They can handle racism from outside, and they can handle accusations from inside their culture about not being Black enough. They decide to either work with just other Black people, to ally themselves with people from various different races, or to also include LGBTQ plus individuals and white men. Finally, a Black individual reaches internalization commitment and has a wide range of identities. Educational administrator Jean Kim developed an Asian American identity development model during her training in 1981. She found Asian American identity began in early childhood with the discovery of ethnic awareness from the family. And this was, she studied Japanese families. It progresses to alienation from one's self and other Asian Americans and social identification with whites. Changing from a personal to a social perspective, Asian Americans next awaken to a new political perspective, which continues with personal and cultural exploration and appreciation of the Asian American experience as a person redirects to an Asian American consciousness. In the final stage of incorporation, individuals blend their Asian American identity with the rest of their identities. Now, I was unable to find an identity development scale applying to Pacific Islanders, but there is one applying to Filipinos, by Kevin Nadal. He recognized the limitation of several Asian American identity models, the most commonly used of which was Kim's, and created one applicable to Filipinos. Yes, he spells it with a P. Ethnic awareness in early childhood is followed by assimilation, potentially for an entire lifetime. He calls out skin complexion as a cause for potential pride or shame. Realizing one's fertility to achieve whiteness precipitates awakening, which he borrows from Kim, manifested often by anger. Unique to Filipinos are 2 stages, according to Nadal. The first is emergence of a pan-ethnic Asian American consciousness with potential assimilation into Asian identity. The second is an empowerment around Filipino identity. The individual may choose to orient towards Latinx, African American, and or Pacific Islander cultures due to shared experiences with each of these 3 groups. Nadal's final stage is borrowed from Kim. Ferdman and Gallegos pointed out how Latinos originated from indigenous, African, European, and even Asian origins, and don't fit within US racial lines. They created a Latinx model that is not based on stages of development, but based on orientation, namely, a Latino integrated orientation, in which individuals critically appreciate the full complexity of Latino identity. Latino-identified orientation, in which culture is typically secondary to La Raza, a pan-Latino identity. Subgroup identified, a focus, an orientation focused on one's own ethnic or national origin. Latino as other, focuses on being a minority more than being a Latino or Latina. Undifferentiated denial, individuals who see themselves as just people. And finally, white identified, those who value and prefer whiteness. Walker S. Carlos Poston answered, what happens with biracial folks? First, in personal identity, one has a sense of self unrelated to ethnic group as a child. Growing up, individuals choose a group as a result of social pressure, then become categorized in a process influenced by group status, parents, cultural knowledge, and appearance. In stage 4, individuals feel guilt and confusion about not expressing all of their identities and possibly explore the other identity. This leads to an appreciation of multiple identities followed by a sense of wholeness or integration. Models of racial identity in the 80s and 90s didn't address Native American identity factors like legal and political considerations, psychosocial factors, proximity or access to a given culture, socialization, and one's own sensibility. Perry Horse addressed this by describing how Native American identity is related to the following. 1, grounding in one's Native American language and culture. 2, validity of one's heritage, biological heritage. 3, worldview respecting tradition and values. 4, self-identifying as American Indian. And 5, membership in a tribe. Janet Helms breached the minds of white folks in 1990 when she described white racial identity development. In the first stage, the first phase that consists of 3 stages, abandonment of racism, we begin with stage 1, contact. In this stage, white individuals see themselves as colorblind. Helms describes this as the happy racist stage. Something then happens in disintegration when whites realize the implicit rules of race and that they cannot violate these social rules. Maybe, for instance, she says they attempt to date a Black person, but their parents object. Most white Americans are in the next stage, reintegration. They blame people of color and feel self-conscious about being white. They look for validation of their own struggles, have positive stereotypes of white people, argue that, quote, anyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, unquote, and may attempt to avoid guilt and shame through hostility and anger. Should they evolve into a non-racist identity, the next phase, they first become pseudo-independent. In this stage, they see racism, but whites still have a sense of unconscious superiority. They articulate principles of fairness. For instance, they may understand educational inequities, but still send their own children to white schools. White people think but don't feel racism in this stage, and they emphasize assimilation as a solution. Helms argues that this stage gets reinforced, in fact, by BIPOC people because it is proactive, and by whites because it is past normal. But further progress can lead to immersion and emersion, like the other models. As whites begin to immerse in racial dynamics, they understand how whiteness contributes towards it. And they begin to correct other white people. Now, on a mission, quote unquote, they emerge and use their own privilege against racism. They may experience anger towards and alienation from other white people. The final stage in the second phase is autonomy. A healthy understanding of self, moving beyond guilt to strategically use whiteness to challenge structural racism, and working alongside BIPOC people without a sense of superiority. Let's move on to intersectionality. Intersectionality, a product of radical feminism, links the concepts of identity formation, which we just discussed, to effective solidarity, with which I will leave you. Since Sojourner Truth's 1851 "Ain't I a Woman" speech to white feminists, Black feminists have pointed out the unique experience by which they cannot, to quote the Combahee River Collective, separate race from class, from sex oppression, because in our lives, they are most often experienced simultaneously. The 1964 Civil Rights Act requires claimants to identify what is the primary discrimination. Legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw once learned how a Black woman in Ohio named Emma DeGraffenreid Reed sued a car factory for not hiring her. All the Black people hired were men doing physical labor. All the white women hired were white for secretarial work. DeGraffenreid Reed actually lost her case because the judge indicated that the employer did hire both women and Black people. Crenshaw analyzed how the judicial decision was wrong because it failed to consider how discrimination can exist at the intersection of two or more oppressed identities. Initially, feminist scholars considered that race, class, and gender constitute axes of oppression that characterize Black women's experience within a more generalized matrix of domination. Scholars like Crenshaw later modified their model to account for all the ways in which oppressions can be layered on individuals, such as these. In the words of Dr. Angela Rose Black, and this is important because I'm going off script, in a very prominent conference, a incorrect introduction to the topic of intersectionality, in which all kinds of aspects of one, like whether you went to a state school or an Ivy League school, and et cetera, were considered to be aspects of this model, and that's not the case. So in the words of Dr. Angela Rose Black, the true meaning of intersectionality is the presence of, quote, multiple boots on your neck, unquote. We see this experience perfectly embodied in the genius of queer Chicana writer Gloria Anzaldúa, the sixth generation Chicana, who grew up literally and figuratively on a Mexican-US border that crossed her family's lands. Her 1981 co-edited book, This Bridge Called My Back, is a landmark in intersectionality, uniting women of color in a classic anthology of radical feminism. Her work, The Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza, written intentionally in both Spanish and English to reflect the Chicana linguistic experience, galvanized queer folks and Chicanas and queer Chicanas like her, who were previously silenced and sidelined within a paternalistic Chicano culture in which, quote, males make the rules and laws and women transmit them, unquote. Anzaldúa spent her entire life on the margins. As a Chicana and lesbian, she leveraged intersectionality into a superpower and showed how mestizas and other marginalized groups have an insight, la facultado, excuse my pronunciation, which empowers them to perceive where others cannot perceive and lead where others cannot lead. Let's conclude with solidarity. 102 years ago, the US went through months of white mob anti-Black violence known as Red Summer, and dozens of attacks on Black communities in dozens of locations around the country. Hundreds of men, women, and children were shot and burned and lynched, and thousands more were displaced from their homes. 2 years later, 100 years ago, Black Wall Street was destroyed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as white racists destroyed 35 city blocks and killed 300 people, chilling Black ingenuity and self-help across the country for decades to come. But did you know that less than 2 weeks before Black Wall Street, an interracial coalition won a victory that should encourage every one of us to committed action in solidarity with one another? They declared in their program the following words: half a century ago in America, slavery was abolished. Now there has arisen need for another great effort in order that prejudice may be overcome. Correction of the present wrong requires no army, for the field of action is the hearts of our citizens. The instrument to be used is kindness, the ammunition, understanding. The actors in this engagement for right are all the inhabitants of these United States. The great work we have to do, and for which this convention is called, is the establishment of amity between the white and the colored people of our land. side note, that was the discussion at that time. It was always white and colored. When we have put our own house in order, then we may be trusted to carry the message of universal peace to all mankind, unquote. So finally, I want to thank you for your attention, and good luck on your discussions.